Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, I've got 10 o'clock, so I figure we'll get this thing started. Welcome to Old Stories, New Ways, the evolution of Indigenous narratives. I'm just going to load up our PowerPoint here.
Thank you, everybody, for getting up this early, coming to an early panel.
That's not what I want at all.
This is early.
I know.
Apparently, some people.
Why is it
Yeah. If you haven't gone to bed yet,
Oh,
you're looking
sweet.
forward to your
Okay.
nap later.
Okay. So, yes, thank you all for coming. My name is Chris Apple. I am the IT manager for Sparky Pants Studios. We make the Elder Scrolls Legends, a creative, the tradable card game.
I'm Lisa Kincaid. I'm now a civil servant for the federal government, but originally grew up in Oklahoma, of Sac and Fox and Cheyenne, Southern Cheyenne descent. I grew up playing video games in convenience stores and renting Super Nintendos from the store, the whole game system and the games before joining the Marine Corps, and then ended up here.
Okay, folks, I am Dustin Richardson. I'm a Blackfeet descendant. I'm also a licensed clinical counselor in Maryland, and I'm the clinical director of Native American Lifelines, which is a Title V urban Indian healthcare program. Sorry for the long title.
Thanks to you.
Perfect, thank you.
Storytelling is the backbone of tradition. It serves as a link between past and present and a way to the future. It's sharing history, education, humor, and even healing. Predominantly, it's an oral tradition. It's used different mediums for different cultures, weaving, pottery, paintings, and adapting however necessary to carry on their ways.
And so really one of the main reasons that we decided to do this presentation panel, we really wanted to look at how game narratives, especially ones that have Indigenous characters and Indigenous representation, are interpreted by folks both who are Indigenous and then also by folks who aren't. Oops. All right, so just a little bit about demographics. A lot of times when I give some information about Natives, people don't know that much, and there are a lot of reasons for that, so I'd just like to give a little bit of information. So about 1.2% of the U.S. population identifies as Native American. That number varies a lot, actually, just because of issues with data gathering, and particularly the U.S. Census. There are right now 573 federally recognized tribes. That number grows. Basically, you actually have to fight to be recognized by the federal government. There are 2 state-recognized tribes that we have in Maryland that are not federally recognized, the Ocohonic and the Piscataway. Right now, we're essentially on Piscataway land. And so the other thing that people tend to not know is most Native Americans do not live on reservations. A lot of people don't think they encounter many natives. Usually that's actually not the case. About 70 to 78%, again, depending on the census, of Native Americans living in the U.S. today do not live on reservations. They live in urban environments, actually particularly large cities. And yes, I won't get too much into some rates, but basically Native Americans have the highest rates of pretty much any type of vulnerability you can imagine in the U.S. So they're more likely to have victimization, they're more likely to be in poverty, they're more likely to have higher rates of mental illness and medical issues that are preventable. And if we even just circle forward, as a dark thing for a Friday morning. I promise it gets better. But, you know, right now, nationally, suicide in the U.S. is a huge issue. I actually sit as a commissioner on the Maryland Suicide Prevention Commission. And it is a big issue nationally as rates are kind of going up. And there are a lot of demographics that are rightly getting a lot more attention. So especially, you know, like older Caucasian, both men and women. But just from this chart that you can kind of see up here, Native Americans have always had a higher rate of suicide. It's getting higher, and it's actually increasing faster than any demographic. So this is some of the reasons why we like to talk about, you know, Indigenous gaming and Indigenous representation, because all of this has actually influenced things like this. And so today what we're going to be doing a lot of in therapy, we call it broaching culture. And really all of that means is coming in like a genuine, honest way for whatever you are. You know, I'm a mix of, you know, Scots, Irish, and Blackfeet. And obviously, as we introduced ourselves, we tried to be very honest with who we are and where we're coming from. And we hope that, you do the same, because we're really trying to come to a better understanding and give people some more insights and a deeper appreciation of yourself and, some other cultural stuff. So when we did this presentation, we kind of wanted to have some type of psychological or psychosocial lens to look at some of these games. I know I'm dropping heavy stuff on a Friday morning. I apologize. Helms, and so I can say I'm sorry. Anyway, I don't have to mean it, but yeah. So we decided on Helms' white racial identity development model. Helms was basically a social psychologist who really was interested in especially how dominant cultures acculturated and managed especially things of racism and racial identity, and really had several stages of a model that kind of go through understanding another culture and particularly racism. The first stage of this model, and y'all don't need to remember this, we'll be going through it throughout, so don't worry too much about it. But first part is contact. This is generally people who are colorblind, who basically think that race is not an issue, and really don't acknowledge race, like almost period. Usually people who think that we're like all human beings. Disintegration, so this is actually a place where people can become very anxious and uncomfortable because they realize, hey, there's racism out there. There's racial discrimination for a whole bunch of different reasons and in different ways. And usually it can be pretty stressful for people. This usually gives way to reintegration, which is actually interesting. So actually when you think of people who are typically racist, think of like Archie Bunker or Eric Cartman, this is actually where they sit. And this sometimes confuses people because colorblindness is lower on this model than being racist. But if you're actually racist, you're actually usually acknowledging that there's some type of difference. And that's actually a good thing. It's moving forward, it's imperfect, but it's really not a bad thing. But you see people in this stage tend to blame the victim. You see people in this stage really have a minimal understanding of privilege, and they might even kind of fight back against it. Pseudo-independence would be the next part. And so really a person begins to a more honest and genuine attempt to understand race, and really goes through efforts to reduce some issues with racism, but it's not like big. They're really going to kind of stay in their lane and maybe do a little bit of stuff, but really in some ways it's going to be almost superficial. And then the next part is immersion and immersion. So an individual is making a much more genuine attempt to connect to his or her own culture. So when it says his or her own culture, you're usually talking about dominant culture, which is normally either white, Caucasian, examining issues with privilege, especially, again, of a dominant race, and then examining methods of their preferred growth. Normally, they try to also seek out people who've gone through this as well. So this is kind of a person who maybe has gone to a couple Black Lives Matter like rallies, and then they try to find a group similar to themselves who they're trying to figure out how they can support the cause while managing their own identity. And then finally, autonomy. So this is really where you want people to be. So this is where people actually have a really good understanding of themselves and their race and their identity, but then also the race and identity of, disenfranchised people, and particularly minorities. And really, they tend to be a lot more knowledgeable and happy. So we're actually going to start to go into game stuff. So content warning. First game that we're going to be covering is... not a classy game. Get ready for some cartoon nudity in all 16 pixels of its glorious action on a Friday. Not shaming anyone if that's your thing, but this is where we are. So Custer's Revenge. So Custer's Revenge was a game released in 1982. This is actually the original artwork for the game, and really it was based off of this guy, General Armstrong Custer. The development was very interesting. It was made by Mystique for the Atari. And really, Mystique felt like that porn was really going to be moving into games, and it was going to be this really big thing. Don't quite know if that happened, but that's not my world. I don't know. But really, the goal of this specific game was to dodge arrows in order to rape a captive Native American woman tied to a pole. Pretty bad by most standards. Both women's groups and Native American organizations immediately spoke out about its release, but it's still like infamous as a terrible game, and you can actually still find some flashes of it online. And there is actually some talk of a remake. I don't know if the article was trolling, but you know, in 2009, if people are still talking about the game, then it's still kind of part of the culture. So this is actual footage of 3 pixels of, animated dick. But yeah, so this very much represents kind of what the game was about. And the hard thing, so looking at games like this, we tried to look at some of the historical background that was happening that could have influenced the game, both like past as well as current development. So the Battle of Little Bighorn is a huge deal within Native culture, and some people call it a Battle of Little Bighorn versus Custer's Last Stand. For Natives, it's the Battle of Greasy Grass. And so, you know, the other big thing about this battle is it led to atrocities that were committed throughout westward expansion after, kind of in the name of Custer, when really you could argue that Custer ran into a very large group of natives who were only gathering to decide what they were going to do for the federal government, and they wanted to both have as many people as possible to understand and talk, but then also to have some level of defense. But the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred 14 years after Custer's death, which is a huge historical piece for the Oglala Lakota. Like, we just hit the new year. They post the names of everyone who died in that massacre and everyone who was wounded, and they do that every single year. It is extremely significant. And like games like this, they don't really end up respecting that, and they certainly don't even, I think, do any homage to Custer as well. And the other really interesting thing about this game is when it was being developed. So the Indian Mineral Development Act, not going to read the whole thing, but basically it was an act that outlined and hopefully encouraged people on reservations to manage their own natural resources, which this has gone kind of back and forth with the federal government. And it's a really big deal because 25% of all of the U.S.'s current natural resources sit on reservations. And this is considering everything that got taken away, right? So that is a huge amount of money and material wealth, but most tribes actually have a really hard time accessing it, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons for it. But then the other big thing that happened during the development of this game was the Seminole tribe versus basically the Supreme Court, and that essentially upheld tribes' rights to have casinos. So I don't know how much people know about Indian gaming, but it is a really, it's one of the few methods that some tribes have to have like a sustainable economy within their own sovereignty. And this allowed them to basically continue to do that. So again, these are really big things happening in the background of a very strange game. Analysis, we put this game in contact. So that very first, stage where really you don't understand pretty much anything. You're really blind to racism, the sexual issues, the sexual assault, and I mean, really, it's kind of amazing the game was created in the first place. I mean, it's a terrible game for the gameplay, but it basically makes everyone dumber who is possibly involved. So, good way to start.
All right, so the next game we looked at to analyze was Tarak the Dinosaur Hunter. So we're going to fast forward into the 90s a little bit. So in Tarak, you play as Talset, a Saquon warrior who assumes the mantle of Tarak. So if you didn't know, Tarak is not this guy's name. In fact, Tarak is not a name at all, it's a title. And Saquon is a fictitious Native American tribe that they invented for the story. And they're a family of time travelers who defend the barrier of Earth and the Lost Land, a mythical place where time has no meaning. And the eldest son in each generation of this family are supposed to defend Earth from this lost land. And so Tarak fights dinosaurs, and also robot dinosaurs. and collects pieces of a powerful artifact to defeat this guy called the Campaigner, who wants to rule all of time by breaking the barrier between Earth and the Lost Land. And if you didn't know that Tarak had such a complex plotline, you are not alone. Because it wasn't in the game at all. The game really focused on first-person shooting, and the story was really in the player's manual and other, contemporary publications. So, where did this crazy idea for a game come from? Well, it turns out before it was a video game, Tarak was a comic book, way back in the 50s. And the creators wanted to tell a story about a land before time. So they chose a pre-Columbian people, a tribe of Native Americans, to get lost in this lost land where dinosaurs had never gone extinct. And in the comic, they're stuck there, and they have to survive in sort of a multi-generational way, and they have to learn to fight the dinosaurs and pass on the mantle of defending the people from father to son. The original Tarak wasn't a time traveler. He was just stuck there. And so in the 90s, Acclaim got the idea, we want to reboot Tarak. We want to turn it into a video game. And when they did that, they changed a couple of things. Made him a time traveler, and they took some other liberties. They made it a lot more action-oriented than survival-oriented. So why would they change parts of the story but choose to keep Talset's Native American identity? There are a lot of possible explanations. There is some interesting legislation that happened in the 90s regarding Native Americans, but I want to look at what we're seeing appear in the cinema in the 1990s. So these films all came out in the early 90s, right before Tarak. They had large budgets and tons of marketing, and they really started to go beyond our traditional cowboys and Indians westerns of yesteryear. And we're seeing Hollywood now with this kind of huge interest and appetite to explore Native American cultures, to do more research, to care about representation, to make depictions more accurate, and to focus on Native characters as more of the protagonist. Now, in some ways, these films are still all about white men. They do have some problems that might reappear later in our presentation, but at least there is sort of an appetite. There's an interest in exploring this. And that's kind of the background for when Tarak was coming out. These things were coming out contemporarily. Where on the acculturation model does Tarak fall? Well, I put it somewhere between contact and disintegration. So contact, you'll remember, is, I don't see race, I'm blind to racism, we're all just human beings. And disintegration is where you're starting to realize that, yes, there are sort of a difference in culture between, me and other people. And I may recognize that racism has some problems, and I want to do something to help, but my understanding of racism and of the differences between the culture is a little superficial. So sometimes the actions I take to help actually wind up making things worse, or are misinterpreted, or aren't helpful. So I don't think Tarak is intentionally disparaging. I don't think it's satire, but it's not especially representative. So I don't know too many people who looked at that picture and said, I really get that guy. I really know what he's going through. I've been there, man. So it's kind of removed from any historical or cultural context. Tarak doesn't bring any aspect of his culture to the game or of his history. The Saquon aren't even mentioned, his heritage isn't mentioned. So in that regard, his portrayal can be hard to understand. Why choose a native portrayal if you're not going to do anything with it? You might notice here in the photo, he's got his harebone breastplate on. That's sort of an iconic Plains tribe piece of regalia. And if, like me, you were wondering if this would really protect anyone from a dinosaur attack, here it is on the front of the box, not protecting Tarak from a dinosaur attack. This character is supposed to be from the 19th century. Maybe he just didn't have time to change clothes before he got sucked into the Lost Land, except, well, no, he's rocking a pair of Levi's in this exact same picture. So why then did he not purchase a Kevlar vest when he went to the 21st century to get his combat boots? And without a convincing in-game answer to that kind of question, people can start to feel like this is a stereotyped character. It creates a problem for representation. The devs probably did not consider what Native people would think when they saw Tarak. And so what was meant to be inclusion can start to feel like ridicule, because the character isn't convincing. The character isn't really that deep. So yeah, somewhere between Contact and Disintegration. Trying to represent Native people, but sort of lacking the best understanding of how to do it.
Next game that we'll be talking about is Prey, which was another step forward, well, in some ways. So in 2000, it was released in 2006, and really it focused on Tommy, who's a Cherokee mechanic living on a reservation. And the game, in part, starts out at a bar with his girlfriend and his grandfather, when suddenly they all are abducted by aliens and need to fight their way out. I know this happens to me every time I go to the res. So, Grandpa actually dies, but he ends up passing along spiritual powers to Tommy, letting him walk through walls, evade enemies, use portals, and have a spirit hawk that very much stood out in my memory, but not of my co-panelists, which I thought was funny. So the interesting thing about the development release of this game, so again, very much a first-person survival horror, but this game was in development forever. So it started in 1995, and I'm not going to go through everything, but basically it started with Human Head Studios, who lingered on the game for a while. It went under contract for 3D Realms, and then finally it was published by 2K Games. In theory, it was supposed to honor the Cherokee, both narrative traditions, and they actually wanted to make several games that did just that. The initial concern actually was whether or not people could identify with a Cherokee like protagonist. And there were mixed issues with cultural representations in the game. I'm not going to go into them exhaustively because we got a lot to cover. But the voice actors who both voice, the main protagonist as well as his girlfriend Jen, they're both Plains Cree, and they're representing Cherokee, and it's not necessarily unremarkable, so in a lot of representation with natives, you might not be able to find somebody of the tribe who has the acting or fits the character, but these same people, they were also major cultural consultants in the game, and there's a lot of difference between Cherokee and Cree culture. Really with Indigenous people, there's so much variance between tribes, it's really hard to capture. So that's one major issue. And interesting stuff in terms of the history that was happening around the background of this game. So in 2000, Congress passed really an act that recognized the Navajo code talkers. I'm betting most people have heard of them. It wasn't just the Navajo. There were actually a bunch of tribes who participated in this. Some learned Navajo, some were other languages as well. But this was one of the first big acts that really helped to honor a major contribution by Native Americans in U.S. history. And again, background of the game. Now the interesting thing, so in February of 2006, the Bush administration made a tremendous cut to Indian health care. So Native Americans are actually the only people in the United States who are guaranteed health care by federal legislation. Technically, no one else is. And so to cut the budget, and they were cutting it to urban programs. So again, urban programs serve that bigger population of Native Americans. That is tremendous. And there was a huge, huge outcry, again, while the game's being developed and released, about this. But even after all the outcry, they still cut it by $110 million. And if you felt like maybe they might have learned a lesson, they didn't. The next year, they cut it by another $65 million. So bigger things. So Dustin, with the analysis of Prey, I put it really within Disintegration, and really you can kind of see that with the anxiety about the game's development. So I think the developers were really looking at what could be better, how they could have culture in the game in a meaningful way, and it took them a long time to try to figure out how they were going to do it. And again, it was certainly, I think, a step forward, but really there was a lack of understanding, especially about Native storytelling, the use of the totem, as much as I love the hawk, and really even the core elements of the grandfather spirit in the gameplay.
And that brings us to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, released in 2018. I believe this was the final trilogy bringing her to become the Tomb Raider. Join action archaeologist Lara Croft as she journeys to the hidden South American city of Paititi, befriends its inhabitants, fights terrorists, steals a secret artifact, sort of on purpose, which triggers a cataclysm that then she has to stop, obviously, by doing some rituals, narrowly avoiding human sacrifice, and taking it upon herself to save the city from the big bad. Kalima! Okay, that's not actual game footage. Meanwhile, we have several organizations that have publicly denounced the Peruvian government for failing to protect uncontacted tribes, and the deforestation of the Peruvian Amazon affecting local indigenous groups without the consultation for the government's aggressive pursuit of development. Audible sigh. So there was supposedly lots of research that involved work by cultural advisors. We're not sure if they were academic, we're unlikely they were indigenous people from those cultures. There was no mention of it, we couldn't find it anywhere. Yet they inadvertently glorified a colonizing protagonist and worldview. They really failed to portray an indigenous people as a relatable or realistic culture. It's possible that the initial intent was to portray the indigenous culture in a more realistic light, but they abandoned this due to production difficulties possibly. They did change developers throughout the middle of the game, so that probably might have taken them a little bit of a different way. The game features an immersive language option where Spanish, Yucatec, and Quechua can be heard spoken by the NPCs as they walk around, but they are stuck in a constant loop that are more than anything just a backdrop for Lara's world. There's definitely a white savior problem in the game where the people have missions for her, where these people who've lived in this Peruvian jungle for their entire lives, centuries, generations, and this white European rich woman shows up and helps them get the things that they could never have done before she got there. Thanks, Lara. What would we have done without you? This falls in the pseudo-independence on the model. The culture's included, but imperfectly, or inconsistently represented. It's put on a pedestal one moment and then dragged through the mud the next. Did I go through any of them?
Yeah. So the next one we want to look at is This Land Is My Land, which went into early access in 2019. It hasn't officially released yet. So in this game, you play as the leader of a warrior camp in the 19th century West. You repel invaders settling your lands, and you rally other camps and groups to your cause to help fight the invaders in a more organized way, to form an organized resistance. So the game only says 19th century West, but I put this at about 1869 or later based on the railroads and the firearms available in the game. So this is a map of what Western North America would have looked like at that time. And you can see the state borders are pretty close to what they are today. Not all of these are officially states yet. A lot of these are what they call territories, which are incorporated, they have a government, but they're not part of the US. They're kind of a temporary or provisional government with their own laws. And the reason that's important is that each one of them was allowed to write their own constitution and have their own way of dealing with issues that came up. All of them were established on top of lands that belonged to indigenous people, and so all of them had to come up with a way to grapple with that, and a lot of them were tacitly approving of violence towards these indigenous people to get them off the land. With the railroads being completed, a ton of settlers were coming west, and there was this big demand for land, and so a lot of the governments just turned a blind eye to violence, to all kinds of horrible things, just to clear this land for new settlers to show up. In red are areas that are designated Indian reservations, and you can see a giant red splotch where Oklahoma is today. It's labeled Indian Territory, and that's because in 1830, President Jackson and Congress concocted a plan to evict all of the tribes back east from their ancestral lands because they decided they just couldn't share the land with indigenous people anymore. So this is often called the Trail of Tears. It was a forced relocation where all the tribes were required to move into Indian territory and were supposedly by treaty guaranteed to keep this territory in perpetuity. Now, this was kind of a pattern of disenfranchisement. The U.S. had a bad habit of signing these treaties and then later reneging them. In fact, since the Declaration of Independence until when the game is set in 1869, the U.S. had signed about 370 treaties with indigenous nations and subsequently violated every single one of them. So in the West, there weren't as many treaties. It was really more, settlers versus these indigenous people and just sort of unorganized violence. One point I do want to make, the West is often romanticized as being, empty wilderness and it had to be tamed, but it's not. This is the starting camp that you get in the game. And it's historically reasonable. This is a Shoshone Encampment, a photograph from 1870. And the teepees look about the same, the design looks about the same, but what the game doesn't show are these vast cultural centers, these vast civic centers that existed in the West. This is Acoma Pueblo in the New Mexico Territory, 1904. This city has been continuously inhabited for 2,000 years. And there were dozens of these pueblos in the West. It is estimated there were hundreds of thousands of indigenous people in the West during this time. Let's see. Also historically realistic is the game's main premise. There was sustained resistance of a coalition of tribes in California against insurgents, the white settlers who were coming in between 1840 and 1870. And there were a lot of different tribes sort of worked together, kind of guerrilla-style tactics. And also there is historical precedent for a charismatic individual going to different tribes and organizing a larger scale resistance. So right around the time the game takes place, an Oglala Lakota named Red Cloud was organizing different tribes on the plains in a big resistance against the US Army. And they succeeded in sacking a number of forts and actually forced the US to issue some reparations to renegotiate a treaty that was more favorable for the Native American tribes. So I want to touch real quickly on Indian warfare, or indigenous warfare, excuse me. It was sometimes customary for a non-violent style of warfare to be preferred. In fact, it was more honorable sometimes to run into battle, touch your opponent, and then run out without being touched, sort of a game of tag. That was much more preferable than actually drawing blood and killing. And this was, some cultures call this counting coup. And this was, it varied from culture to culture. But actual bloodshed was often limited in scope. And large scale, like armies fighting armies, was extremely rare. It was undesirable by many indigenous cultures. And so you can imagine kind of the culture shock and the existential threat when this, unknown force of white settlers preferred to fight from afar, and preferred bloodshed over the nonviolent option. So the game kind of echoes this belief in its karma system. So different warrior camps will not follow you if you have fought in a cowardly way, if you've chosen to kill the white settlers versus sneaking up on them and knocking them out and scaring them. And that's, both of them are possible in the game. It's a lot harder to sneak up on them. And this is my game after I killed like 80 people and I didn't realize it was bad. And then no one would join me anymore and now I'm stuck. So where does this land fall on the acculturation model? Pseudo-independence is where I'm going, and as a reminder, that is where you have begun to realize that systemic racism does exist. You are generally sympathetic to the other culture, to the minority culture, but you don't always do anything about it. And you understand the other culture in terms of your own. So you may understand that they are different and they have different customs, but you relate to them by comparing them to yourself. So the developers have given an interview in the past, and this game was born of a desire to play as a Native American warrior. So this is good, at least there's an attempt at representation. The protagonist is explicitly pan-indigenous and represents all tribes, large and small, from all across the United States. So there are some problems with representation there that we're kind of obfuscating, the specific cultures that did fight in the West with every indigenous culture in the country. There's content warning, there's more cartoon nudity coming up. So there was an attempt at historical accuracy. We can tell that from the objects and the setting. There's an attempt at cultural understanding, but the reason for these decisions isn't clear. It's not clear if we're implementing this karma system because we want to pay homage to the native belief, or if we just saw it in Mass Effect and thought it was cool and we wanted to put it in our game too. The developer cites Karl May as an inspiration. Now, Karl May is a German author from the 19th century, and he was famous for popularizing Native Americans in Europe, but often the natives in his story would take on German archetypes rather than Native American archetypes. So they would do things that Europeans would find honorable and not necessarily natives. And to kind of exemplify this, his main character, Winnetou, upon his death, asked some settlers to sing Ave Maria for him, and in his final moments he is quietly dignified by his conversion to Christianity, and here he is rising up into heaven, the feather coming off his hair at the last moment. All right, so yeah. So it's stuff that a 19th century German audience would have liked, but it's pretty clear that a Native American audience wouldn't have been able to connect with this. So maybe the devs aren't fully supportive of Karl May's views, but it definitely raises that question, how much of Karl May's views went into developing this game? One of the developers' quotes is, Native Americans faced a choice of becoming part of the alien civilization or disappearing, and a lot of indigenous people have had some problems with this premise because it obscures a whole lot of other choices that people did and still do have. Resisting was one option, which is what you do in the game, and also finding a balance, finding a way to integrate without removing your own identity, which is, it can be a core struggle to some people's identity, and that kind of existence doesn't exist in the game. And a couple of big old caveats. This interview is a couple years old, people change, and this game is in early access, and games change too. So, could be some development.
And this does, well, I have that coming up now. How do I get that down?
Just left click somewhere.
All right.
There you go.
So Never Alone, you notice all the rest of the games, we put them in chronological order of release. This did come out in 2014, but it is our best example of how things can be done. Now, do I need to?
Yeah, I think you have to click again.
Niveaksiarolo perengit ka tautuk tane. Tautukunak tuak sunapayak sa kuminganeksok. Niveaksiarolo iyuliakatinge bisaw laganeksot. Kano po minya? Ado ko lakpas kanyam dahil na kuminyait ka. Tamanga ikumawak toming kaharakpam inyo liptaktok. Sumalagula kami di bayak siya rulo pitingingani. Agalan kaharak paskanyat sa gabing aitik. Imenyaw sa gabing sa mga nunamin pagkakuting. Nunak kami.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. As you can see, we wanted to hear how the game's actually played. There's actually not any English spoken throughout it. You're reading through subtitles. It's a puzzle platformer, and it's about a young Inupiaq girl, Nuna, and an Arctic fox who are journeying out to fight and figure out how to stop this blizzard that's about to destroy everything that they've ever known. It's narrated by a master storyteller in the Inupiaq language, which is, it's translated, they have about 10 different subtitle languages in the game. I believe one of the things later on said there's a lot more languages have been added since then. It's inspired by the traditional story of Kunuk Sayuka. It's passed down for thousands of years orally through the tradition by Robert Nasrick Cleveland, and it's transcribed by his daughter Minnie Gray, who is the keeper of the story after he passed. Throughout the game, there are cultural insight videos that you can unlock from progressing through the game. There are storytellers and interviews from elders, other members of the Alaska Native community about the culture and about the amazing Arctic world. Nope, went the wrong way. No, there we go. Nope. Where am
I guess you lost your text.
I lost my text.
Yeah.
Well, this is Nuna and the fox as they're trying to fight through. They go out into the blizzard and they're fighting, and this is what we saw earlier. I'll go on to the next one. And only with the aid of the helping spirits will Nuna and the fox have any chance of survival in a land where survival is impossible. Nuna and the fox escaped the Aurora Borealis. There was one of the stories in the cultural insights that talks about the Aurora Borealis was told to the children as they were children who died, and they went up into the sky and they just wanted to play, so they would come out at night and play. So they would tell the children to pull your hood up so that the Aurora Borealis didn't come down and take your head to play with it. But you can see how that would be a great survival story where kids are afraid of something, but it's to keep them safe in the cold. This is the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. They established Upper One Games, and they actually sought out a developer to help them make the game, as this was part of their, to get additional funding for some of their programs. They partnered with Eline Media to co-develop and co-publish Never Alone. The partnership was to ensure inclusive development between the Alaska Native people and Eline team. The Cook Inlet Tribal Council is actually made up of multiple different tribes and cultures, so it's not all Inupiaq. So this falls on autonomy. It's coming full circle. It's a direct involvement of an Indigenous people. The use of traditional storytelling is a way to pass on knowledge using modern medium. The development team collected feedback from the community. At one point, with the original artwork that came back, they sent it back saying it looked too Disney. So they ended up bringing in a designer from Russia who had studied the Inuit artwork and wanted to make it look more like it was theirs. So there are actually clips throughout it that look like it's their artwork come alive from some of like the baleen and things like that they've used. There's also some of the cultural insights that were unlocked. The contributor and Inupiaq elder, Fanny Akpik, I'm going to butcher that name. She discusses a near loss of her language after being sent to a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school for her junior or 11th and 12th grade year, 10th and 11th grade year. She was sent to Sholaco Indian School in Oklahoma, which is actually where my grandmother was sent to school as well. So I'm kind of fascinated the fact that they possibly could have been in the same school together. And this elder discussed remembering taking a bus all the way from Seattle to Oklahoma. I can't even imagine. Some of the specific aspects of the culture that they really wanted to come through the game was the survival and interdependence. There was intergenerational interdependence that they wanted to have, and the resiliency, and just life in the Arctic. Here we have Minnie Gray, as she's recording some of the stories that her father told. In Inupiaq culture, the storyteller, the person who tells the story the longest owns the story, even if it's their culture. It's a story that everybody knows, but the person who tells it the longest. So this was Nastrik's story. And they did evolve and update the story from a boy to a girl because they wanted more women positively represented. And they did have to get permission from Minnie Gray in order to make that change and make sure it didn't change anything. And here she is also with the creative designer, like playing the game a little bit, seeing what the work has come to. And then they even had some of the community members, the young community member here, play testing the game. And then on the right, you can see her, she's cutting muktuk. So some of the events that were going on, like in 2014, if you can think about what was happening in the world that might have allowed some of this game to come about, like social media and the internet really expanded everyone's world. A lot of Indigenous people are far away. Even communities, people who live on reservations, like getting connected to other people throughout the world and bringing us all together, making our voices louder, making our voices heard. And that has really allowed them, once they released the game, it released it out to the world. They released it on Steam, so it hit everybody at the same time. And has also been some legislation to allow native languages to be taught again, and maybe even have some funding to put that back in schools. Maybe it didn't pass yet, but they are working on it. And then we'll move on to our last bit.
Yeah, so really at this point we're gonna start opening up to Q&A. But first off, we just wanted to have a giveaway. Actually, if you folks are not familiar with a giveaway, we have a whole bunch of smudge kits with sage, cedar, and then also essentially some desert sage, along with some medicine bags, which have some little fun things in them. And please feel free to take them. It's actually, so giveaways, we give a gift in order to thank you for your presence, to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming, 10 o'clock on a Friday morning to hear some like fun stuff, but then also like some depressing stuff, and that happens. But yeah, we will be here for a little while. So first off, anybody have any questions or anything that they want to add?
Do any of you have any social media that we can follow you through, like Twitter or YouTube? This might be like really good to know.
I am only on Instagram, but you can, I will get with you after this. Anybody wants information, I can get you on there, and we do have our emails after this as well, so we wait.
And just to repeat that question, it was just a question if we had any social media to follow.
Not quite up on TikTok yet. I don't know if anybody heard that I played arcade games and Odyssey 3.
Just your general opinion. So the way you presented these, there's a good story over time in terms of where we're going on that scale. But do you feel like that's actually what the trend is, or is it? Have you seen some worrying things lately? Is it generally still good?
Just repeat that question, just if there's kind of an improvement over time and if we're seeing more things, hopefully, in autonomy.
I do believe that with a lot of like the social media aspect, allowing natives to be heard, to let people know we don't like what's being told, we want more, we want this to be better. So people do seem like they're hearing what's going on, and they are, like even with Tomb Raider, it seems like they tried to make an effort, and then overall, like they still were just making a Tomb Raider game. So, like they still have the marketing team that's gonna come in, whether or not they have cultural advisors or even the voice actors that are like, I don't really like what this outcome was, but they seem like they're at least attempting to do that, and that's a start, even if it's this late in the game.
I do think for every game we see that advances representation, we also see like a Street Fighter 2, which, and to be fair, Street Fighter 2 is irreverent to everyone's culture, not just native culture. So I don't want to say that it's a step backwards, but it kind of keeps that more stereotyped representation front of mind. It might slow that progress or distract people from the more representative versions.
By saying my husband is Chiricahua and Hopi, and we live out here, and a lot of people, once they find out that he is native, are constantly asking him about the Lenape culture, who are Eastern tribes in East Southwest. Have you guys had that issue yourselves when you do panels and discussions like this, where someone will ask you about a culture, a specific tribal culture that's not yours? How do you handle discussing that?
So just repeat that question. So I guess the core of it is, in panels like this, if we don't necessarily know or have as much contact or aren't a part of a specific people, if you get asked questions kind of that are either for people you don't necessarily know that much about, or have that much information. And since I'll talking, I'll just keep talking. So I do a lot of presentations. I do a lot of education around service for Native Americans, specifically with clinicians and to other practitioners. I do it across the Mid-Atlantic. You will always get asked questions that you just don't know. And especially if you're on the eastern side of the U.S., people don't recognize natives quite as much as in other places. There's a lot of historical reasons for that. So a lot of times what's happening to your husband will happen to a lot of natives, because I counsel natives too. And one of the hardest things for folks, especially if they're coming from out west, is like, how do I explain and like have my culture here when like no one seems to understand, or they lump me in, you know, if they're in Virginia, they'll lump me in with the Pamunkey or the Monacan, and it's like, you know, I'm Oglala Lakota, I don't know anything about the Pamunkey, but the Pamunkey, if you know Pocahontas, Pamunkey. Yeah.
I'm of the Plains people, and a lot of people have, and I'm also mixed race, so that doesn't help. My dad has curly hair, and my mom has stick straight hair, and that really does throw people off a lot. And out here, like especially self-identifying, trying to, people ask like, what are you? It really does give you pause to say, how do I explain what I am, or who I am, or where I came from? Because you can't just say, well, I'm Indian. That's where we say when we were growing up, because that's what we were. Well, out here, that means you're from Asia. You can't say I'm American Indian. It seems similar. Indigenous, Native American, you know, like it gets complicated. Well, and I have an ambiguous face. So it does get very complicated. But, you know, as a Plains Indian out here, I have never even heard of half the tribes that were out here. So it's pretty fascinating to get out here and learn a lot about people. And I try to learn a lot just so I can try to answer some general questions that let people know we're not all the same.
Yes, so with the model that you spoke about and the model that we use like throughout the presentation, how, if you know someone who is on step one, who is on the I don't see race, like what is some of the most efficient ways to help them get to some of the other steps? You know, they'll learn that that's not exactly the best thing.
So you tend to kind of meet people where they're at. So you can kind of use, in therapy, we call it Socratic Questioning, but it's basically like asking questions and making them kind of realize that the answers that they have are insufficient. So if you're like, hey, have you kind of figured this out, or yada yada, and usually the more people talk, the more they realize that they don't really have an answer. And that usually tends to help. You can present some information to them, but a lot of times they'll like resist it, because the whole thing about Helms's model is it really articulates that as you do this, it's not a comfortable thing. And so the question itself was like, how can you get people to move through this if, you know, no matter where they are. And I think that's probably the easiest way, especially if they're just in like contact.
Based on the examples that you presented, Never Alone seemed to be a much more fully realized and all-encompassing example of the type of storytelling that you would like to see more things evolve to. I'm curious about the fact that that particular story centers on a child, and that it omits the complications like with sexism and violence that you see constantly married in the adult story. Do you think that that's more because, like you were saying, the woman owned that story and she was more directly involved and able to tell that story? And do you think that there is a movement towards being able to tell adult stories, if you will, with that kind of accuracy?
Do you want to repeat the question?
So I'm trying to think how I can summarize that really quickly. Is really, you know, for Never Alone, the narrative in the story focuses on a child, and in that way it takes that perspective that's maybe not simplistic, but it doesn't talk about some of the issues of like sexism, some of also like the racism, economic stuff, for probably more adult style stories.
They actually did go through lots of stories just trying to pick the right one, and I think part of the reason they wanted to pick a child story was for the children, for the youth with the Alaskan Natives, to give them pride in like their culture who were far away. Like we have people who've moved away and they're trying to get language back in, like get them excited to learn about their culture again instead of turning away. One of the elders actually called them the Xbox generation, so they were trying to draw them back in. So a new term for millennials, I guess. But I think it's evolving, and they actually are working towards, they called them world games, so there are, I think, more that they want to do and that they're working towards, but even with this one, it took them a couple of years to get to the point of even a release from the initial outset of it, and it's so much time in trying to make sure that they're not disparaging or not hurting the culture in any way, and also giving a positive view. So I think part of that is because there is a lot of, even, substance abuse within the communities and trying to bring people back in, that the more positive the stories that they're trying to show it to make things move forward, like they're trying to get past those points. So I think it's something they really want to do, and maybe like moving forward into like incorporating a lot more wide net of stories, but little by little it does take a while.
I came in late, so I apologize if this was addressed. But what do you think are the duties of developers in looking to, what are the duties of developers, primarily non-native developers, if they want to include stories set in relevant time periods? I'm thinking, for example, Assassin's Creed 3, which, flashes a big message at the start of every game. This is a multicultural team, but they're Ubisoft, they're French. There's sort of an assumption that they're probably not going to be. What would be a duty of somebody like Ubisoft if they're doing a game set in, for example, free America, this continent? What would their duties be in order to be respectful?
So the question was, what would the duties be of the developers to try to incorporate essentially like the getting Indigenous involvement, right? The Assassin's Creed actually, because that particular game actually fell on several lists by Indigenous writers and critics as being a good example of how they worked well with the community and how they got involvement and did a pretty good portrayal of people. So that actually was a good representation as far as the spectrum goes, but that probably is the best model for a lot of them, is just asking and making sure you're not stepping on anyone's toes, that it's not going to be, and you're never gonna, there are other people who probably think that's not a great representation. So I think you're never gonna make everybody happy, but trying to get more involvement will really help people get as many people as possible happy and at least a good representation out there.
Yeah, and what I would just add to that is, if you're looking at the model itself, well, first off, I like the idea of responsibility rather than, a duty, just because of old native phrase, man has responsibility, not power. But if you looked at autonomy, basically, it would just be really coming to understand your own culture as a game developer, as you're coming into an Indigenous culture and trying to involve that as a part of your story and what you're trying to do. Hopefully involving Indigenous people in its development. And then even trying to, in some way, add something that's kind of social justice to the game, or help it go back to the tribe or the people or the community in some way, even if it's just a positive message. It doesn't have to be money. And I would say that would probably be a pretty good formula, because most of the games that we talked about, Never Alone's a great example for how to kind of come together with that community for that type of gameplay and to make it marketable.
I can say from my own game development experience, being as proactive as possible about the impact on your players. Especially if you're featuring a real world character rather than, an alien, I made them up. Okay, you're not going to offend anyone, but if you're featuring a real world example of people being proactive, finding out how that community is going to receive it, finding out how other games have been received. And I do want to point out, sometimes there's disagreement within studios about doing that. And sometimes a lot of the developers can be on board with doing that, and all it takes is one cranky art director or something who's like, well, we don't have time for that, and then it really falls by the wayside. So it's not necessarily an entire company making this decision as a unit.
Oh, yes.
So it's been a long time since I've taken anthropological theory, but I was curious how you landed on the Helms model, and if there are any other models that would be worth considering or looking into.
So the question was just how we kind of came to Helms's model for this presentation, and then if there were any other models that might be useful. We decided on Helms' model honestly because it's very like straightforward. There are a lot of models in theory of like racial identification and actually acculturation for your own culture if you're a minority. And then there are actually less if you're coming from a dominant culture, especially that have been well received in the literature. And Helms was one of those. And Helms it's slightly older, but most of the games we were starting to talk about were older as well. And if you want to stay after, I can get your email and I can send you something that basically actually goes through a couple different models of acculturation, and it's actually really helpful if you have any type of like mixed heritage as well, because I know I find it useful. Yeah.
We're just about out of time. Any
I-
last quick ones? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I just want to say I'm really happy that everybody came here to hear us talk about something that I really wasn't sure we'd have anybody here for. But
Yes, thank you very much.